A once thriving church begins experiencing eerie events. Choir members lose their voices mysteriously, and a shadowy figure appears during midnight rehearsals. The pastor discovers a chilling secret buried in the church's foundation, leading to a life-threatening confrontation with a malevolent force. A young pastor's meteoric rise to fame is disrupted by unexplained deaths of key church members. Rumors of his involvement with a secret cult spread, and a daring journalist digs into his past, uncovering shocking truths that put her life in danger. A struggling church decides to hold a deliverance service at midnight. But as the service progresses, strange occurrences unfold, leaving the congregation trapped inside. The leader must face his own sins to save everyone from a powerful, supernatural force. The sound of heavy rain pounded on the tin roof of Zion Apostolic Church. Inside, the dimly lit sanctuary seemed to shudder with each clap of thunder. The church had seen better days. Its peeling walls whispered of forgotten promises, and its broken windows let in the cold November wind. Pastor Gideon stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling as he read from the book of Psalms. His voice was strong, but his heart was burdened. For months, strange events had plagued the church. It started with the faint whispers during evening prayers, voices that no one could place. Then came the mysterious illnesses among the congregation, and now, the disappearances. 3 members had gone missing in 2 weeks, each vanishing without a trace after attending service. Tonight, the church was packed, not out of faith but out of fear. The people had come seeking answers, but their faces betrayed their doubts. Whispers rippled through the congregation as a figure stepped into the sanctuary. It was a young woman, drenched from head to toe, her white dress clinging to her like a second skin. She walked with an eerie calmness, her bare feet leaving wet footprints on the floor. Pastor Gideon froze mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto her. "Sister, are you here for prayers?" he asked, his voice faltering. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the front pew and sat down, her gaze fixed on the pulpit. The congregation murmured uneasily. Deaconess Rebecca, a sharp-tongued woman in her 60s, leaned over to whisper to Gideon, "Pastor, something is not right. Look at her." But Gideon ignored her. He felt a strange pull toward the woman, a sense that she carried answers he desperately needed. The service continued, but the atmosphere grew heavier. As Gideon preached, the woman remained motionless, her eyes unblinking. When it came time for testimonies, she stood abruptly. "I have a message for this church," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The congregation gasped. No one knew her, yet her words carried an authority that silenced even the most skeptical members. "This church has been marked," she continued. "Not by God, but by something darker. Your walls hide secrets, and your prayers cannot mask the sins buried beneath this ground." Gideon's heart raced. "What do you mean, sister? Who are you?" The woman smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort, it was a warning. "You'll know soon enough. But heed this. If you want to save this place, you must dig up the past." Before anyone could question her further, she turned and walked out into the storm. That night, Gideon couldn't sleep. The woman's words echoed in his mind. He knew the church's history wasn't spotless. Decades ago, it had been built on land rumored to be cursed, a burial ground for outcasts and those who had died violently. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with the church elders. Deaconess Rebecca was the first to speak. "Pastor, that woman was not sent by God. She's a distraction from the enemy." Elder Jonah, an old man with a deep, rumbling voice, disagreed. "Rebecca, open your eyes. Strange things have been happening here for months. Maybe she knows something we don't." The room erupted into arguments until Gideon slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. We need to investigate. If there's truth to her words, we can't ignore it." Reluctantly, the elders agreed. That evening, a group of men began digging in the churchyard, guided by Gideon's instructions. What they found shocked them: a rusted chest buried 6 feet under. Inside were old documents, photographs, and a journal belonging to the church's founder, Pastor Elijah. The journal detailed rituals performed to bless the church, but the descriptions were far from holy. Blood sacrifices, chants, and deals with unknown entities filled the pages. As the chest was brought into the church, a sudden gust of wind blew open the doors. The lights flickered, and a chilling laughter echoed through the sanctuary. "What have you done?" cried Rebecca, clutching her Bible. Before anyone could respond, the young woman appeared again, standing at the entrance. But this time, her face was different, her eyes glowed, and her skin seemed almost translucent. "You've awakened it," she said. "The sins of your fathers cannot be undone, but they can be atoned for. Are you willing to pay the price?" Gideon stepped forward, his voice shaking. "What price?" The woman pointed to the altar. "Sacrifice your pride, your secrets, your lies. Only then will this church be free." As her words sank in, the floor beneath the altar began to crack, revealing a dark void. Screams erupted as shadowy figures emerged, their forms twisting and writhing. Gideon fell to his knees, praying desperately. But the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they whispered his name. The shadows swirled around Gideon, forcing him to confront memories he had buried deep. Years ago, he had covered up a scandal involving embezzlement and the mysterious death of a young choir member. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed to the congregation. "I have sinned. I thought I could hide it, but God sees all. Forgive me." The shadows paused, as if satisfied by his admission. But the void beneath the altar continued to grow. The young woman stepped forward, her form glowing brighter. "It's not enough. The truth must come from all who are guilty." One by one, members of the congregation began to speak, admitting to theft, lies, and betrayals. The church echoed with cries of repentance, but the darkness didn't relent. As the night wore on, Gideon realized that the woman wasn't just a messenger, she was a test. Her presence forced them to face their deepest fears and darkest secrets. But when the last confession was made, she turned to Gideon with a sorrowful expression. "You still don't understand. The price isn't words, it's action." The sanctuary began to collapse, and panic spread. Gideon knew what he had to do. Grabbing the journal, he marched to the altar and threw it into the void. "Take it. Take the sins of this church and leave us in peace." The shadows recoiled and the void began to close. But as the woman vanished, she whispered, "This is only the beginning." 4 days, the congregation stayed away from Zion Apostolic Church. Word of the chaos spread throughout the town, leaving fear and doubt in its wake. Gideon spent every night in the sanctuary, kneeling before the altar, seeking answers from God. On the third night, as he prayed in the dimly lit church, a cold wind swept through the room. The candles flickered, and then the shadows returned, thicker, darker, and more menacing. "You thought it was over," a voice hissed. It wasn't the young woman this time, but something older, angrier. "The sins of your past cannot be erased so easily." Gideon stood, clutching his Bible. "I have confessed. We have repented. What more do you want?" The shadows swirled, taking the shape of a man, tall, with burning red eyes. "Repentance is not enough. The blood spilled here demands retribution." Suddenly, the sanctuary doors burst open, and Deaconess Rebecca stormed in, holding a lantern. "Pastor, I had a vision," she said breathlessly. But when she saw the shadowy figure, she froze. "Rebecca," the figure said in a voice that sent chills down her spine. "You were there when it began. Tell the truth." The deaconess fell to her knees, trembling. "No, no, I did nothing wrong." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the sanctuary. "You watched as they made the deal. You kept silent when the blood was spilled." "Silence is complicity, Rebecca." Rebecca sobbed, her cries piercing the darkness. Gideon stepped forward. "What deal? What blood?" Through her tears, Rebecca began to speak. Decades ago, when the church was first built, the land had belonged to a wealthy, ruthless landowner named Chief Olawu. He had refused to sell the property to Pastor Elijah until the pastor offered him something in return, something unholy. They sacrificed a young girl, Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. A girl accused of witchcraft. They said her blood would purify the land and bring blessings to the church. Gideon's stomach churned. And you knew? You said nothing? Rebecca nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I was young, afraid. I thought it was for the greater good. The shadow laughed again, growing larger. The greater good? Her blood tainted this land. And now you all must pay. The next morning, Gideon gathered the remaining elders and shared Rebecca's confession. Some were shocked, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Is it true? Gideon demanded. Did any of you know about this? Elder Jonah sighed heavily. I heard rumors, but I never believed them. I thought they were just stories to scare us. Then we need to find out the truth, Gideon said. If there's any record of what happened, we must uncover it. They searched the church archives and found an old ledger from Pastor Elijah's time. Hidden among the pages was a receipt for the purchase of the land, signed in Chief Olawa's name. But there was also a chilling note scrawled in the margins. The debt is paid in blood. Gideon felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The young woman, she must have been the girl they sacrificed. Elder Jonah frowned. If that's true, then why is she helping us? Maybe she isn't, Rebecca said quietly. Maybe she's leading us to our doom. That night, Gideon called for a vigil, urging the congregation to return. Despite their fear, many showed up, desperate for answers. As the service began, strange marks started appearing on the walls, handprints as if burned into the plaster. The congregation watched in horror as the marks glowed red, then black, spreading like a disease. Suddenly, a young boy screamed and pointed at his mother. Her arms were covered in the same marks. Then another man cried out, revealing the same marks on his chest. Panic erupted as more and more members discovered the marks on their bodies. Gideon stood at the altar, shouting for calm. Stop, he bellowed. This is not the time for fear. We must pray, together. But the crowd was already scattering, some running for the exits, others collapsing in fear. As chaos consumed the church, the young woman appeared again. This time, her presence seemed more human, but her voice carried the same weight of authority. Do you see now? She asked Gideon. The marks reveal the guilty. Those who benefited from the blood sacrifice are cursed. Gideon approached her, his voice desperate. Tell me how to end this. What must we do? The woman's eyes softened. You must find Chief Olawa's descendant. Only his blood can break the curse. The congregation fell silent as her words sank in. Rebecca gasped. His descendant? But the Olawa family left town years ago. The woman turned to her. Not all of them. One remains. She looked directly at Elder Jonah. All eyes turned to Jonah, who staggered back in shock. Me? No, that's impossible. My family has no connection to the Olawas. The woman raised her hand, and a vision appeared before the congregation. A young Jonah, sitting at Chief Olawa's table, laughing and shaking hands with the ruthless landowner. No, Jonah whispered, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know. I didn't know this would happen. The congregation erupted in anger, demanding answers. But the woman silenced them with a wave of her hand. You have little time, she warned. If the curse is not broken by dawn, this church will fall, and all within it will be claimed. The shadows began to close in again, and the congregation huddled together, their fear palpable. As the shadows loomed closer, the congregation erupted in chaos, their panic rising with every passing second. Elder Jonah fell to his knees, trembling. I swear, I didn't know about the bloodline. My parents never spoke of any connection to Chief Olawa. The young woman's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Ignorance does not erase the blood that flows in your veins. You must make a choice. Accept your responsibility or let the curse consume this church. Gideon stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Jonah's shoulder. Elder Jonah, think carefully. Is there anything at all, that connects your family to the Olawas? Jonah's face contorted with anguish as he struggled to recall. There was a story my grandmother told me when I was a boy. She said my father was born out of wedlock. She claimed my grandfather worked for Chief Olawu as a steward, but she always insisted that was where it ended. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances. Rebecca, her voice sharp with urgency, pressed further. Jonah, if there's even a chance your bloodline ties to him, we need to act now. The young woman raised her hand, and the shadows paused, retreating slightly as if waiting. Bring me proof, she said. Something that links you to Chief Olawu's bloodline. Without it, the curse will not lift. Time was slipping away. The congregation scattered, searching through the church archives and their personal memories for any trace of the Olawu legacy. Rebecca returned to the sanctuary with a faded photograph. Look at this, she exclaimed, holding it up. The picture showed a group of men standing outside the church during its dedication ceremony. At the center was Chief Olawu himself, and standing beside him, barely noticeable, was a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Jonah. Jonah's hands shook as he examined the photograph. That's my father. The congregation fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a storm cloud. The young woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable. The bloodline is confirmed, she said. Now, the price must be paid. Jonah's voice cracked as he asked, What price do you mean? The young woman's gaze turned cold. A life for a life. The curse began with a sacrifice, and it can only end with one. You must offer yourself. Gasps erupted from the congregation. Rebecca stepped forward, shaking her head vehemently. No, this isn't right. Jonah is an elder of this church. There must be another way. But Gideon, his face pale, understood the gravity of the moment. If we don't act, everyone here will suffer, he said quietly. Elder Jonah, the choice is yours. Jonah looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the terrified faces of his fellow church members. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, If my life can save this church, then so be it. The congregation gathered around the altar, their prayers a desperate chorus rising into the night. The young woman stood at the center, her hands raised as she began to chant in a language no one recognized. Jonah knelt before the altar, clutching a cross to his chest. Lord, if this is my fate, I accept it. Forgive me for the sins of my bloodline. The shadows closed in, swirling around Jonah like a storm. The congregation watched in horror as the darkness seemed to consume him, his body glowing faintly before dissolving into light. For a moment there was silence. Then, the shadows vanished, and the sanctuary was filled with an otherworldly warmth. The young woman turned to the congregation, her voice soft but resolute. The curse is lifted, but the wounds of the past will leave scars. Remember this night, and do not repeat the sins of your forefathers. The congregation rejoiced, but their relief was short-lived. As dawn broke, they discovered that the altar had been reduced to ashes, and the church bell, once a symbol of hope, had cracked in half. Gideon stared at the ruins, his heart heavy. Is this truly a new beginning, or have we only delayed another disaster? Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder. We've been given a second chance. Let's not waste it. But as the congregation began to rebuild, a chilling discovery was made. A second chest, buried deeper than the first, containing a note scrawled in blood. The debt is never fully paid. The discovery of the blood-written note sent waves of dread through the congregation. Gideon, Rebecca, and the remaining elders stood frozen, the ominous words burning into their minds. The debt is never fully paid. Rebecca whispered, What does this mean? Wasn't Jonah's sacrifice enough? The young woman, who had lingered in the shadows, stepped forward one last time. Her face, though still serene, now bore traces of sorrow. You misunderstand, she said. The curse has been lifted from this church, but the land itself is tainted. The blood spilled here has roots deeper than you can imagine. Gideon, his voice trembling with frustration, asked, Then what was the point of Jonah's sacrifice? Was it all for nothing? The woman shook her head. Jonah's act of atonement saved your souls and this congregation, for now. But curses tied to blood never truly disappear. They only sleep. You must remain vigilant, for the shadows will return when the sins of greed, pride, or hatred resurface. As the sun rose, the young woman began to fade, her body dissolving into golden light. Her final words echoed through the sanctuary, "You've been given a chance to write a new story. Use it wisely." Weeks passed, and the congregation worked tirelessly to rebuild the church. They erected a new altar and repaired the sanctuary walls. But every time they tried to replace the cracked bell, something strange occurred. The bell tower would creak ominously, and the replacement bell would fall, shattering before it could be hung. Rumors began to spread that the spirit of the sacrificed girl lingered, her anguish tied to the bell that tolled during her death. Some members suggested abandoning the church altogether, while others insisted on holding firm. Gideon decided to take matters into his own hands. One night, alone in the church, he climbed the bell tower with a lantern and the Bible, determined to pray until the curse was broken. As he reached the top, the air grew icy and the lantern flickered. A faint sobbing echoed around him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The sobbing grew louder, and then a whisper filled the air. "Why did you let me die?" Gideon froze. You're the girl they sacrificed, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The sobbing stopped, replaced by a bitter laugh. "Yes. And no one came for me. No one stopped them. They built this church on my pain and called it holy ground." Gideon knelt, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I can't undo what was done, but I promise to honor your memory and ensure no one else suffers as you did." The sobbing softened, and the icy air grew warmer. A faint outline of the girl appeared, her face now peaceful. "If you keep your word, this church will stand. But if you betray it, the shadows will return, stronger than before." As she disappeared, the cracked bell glowed faintly, and when dawn broke, the congregation found it miraculously restored. Gideon shared his encounter with the congregation, and together they vowed to ensure that the church would remain a place of justice, truth, and compassion. The story of the young girl became a sacred lesson, passed down to every new member. But not everyone was convinced the curse was truly gone. Some members claimed to see fleeting shadows during evening prayers, and others reported hearing faint whispers in the bell tower. Rebecca approached Gideon one evening and said, "Do you think we've truly earned redemption?" Gideon sighed. "I don't know. But I do know this. We can't let fear control us. We must stay vigilant and ensure this church is a place of light, not darkness." Years later, as Gideon prepared to retire, a historian visited the church, drawn by its mysterious history. While examining the archives, he uncovered a journal belonging to Chief Olawo. The journal revealed something horrifying. The sacrifice of the girl was not an isolated act. Chief Olawo had performed similar rituals on every piece of land he owned, binding them all with blood to ensure his power and wealth. When Gideon read the journal, his hands shook. "This isn't over," he whispered. "It was never about just this church. The darkness extends beyond these walls." Rebecca, now elderly but still sharp, said, "Then we must warn others. We can't let this curse spread." But as they spoke, the church bell began to toll on its own, its deep, haunting sound echoing across the town. A cold wind swept through the sanctuary, and Gideon's Bible fell open to a single verse. "Be sure your sin will find you out," Numbers 32:23. The congregation gathered outside, watching as storm clouds rolled in, casting the church in shadow once more.